Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Fireside Chat. I'm joined today by Christine Ardal, who is with us today from Norway. So, Christine, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's my pleasure.
So, you and I got to know each other, I think, back in the Drive AB days, as I recall. So,
Absolutely.
so actually, so let's rewind a little further than that. Tell me a little, tell everybody a little bit about you, how you became a public policy wonk, why I met you at Drive AB, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Drive AB.
Well, I'm an American. You can probably hear that. My home here is in Norway. I've been living out of the States now for more than 20 years. I moved to Norway in 2005, and I had quite my background in the US. I worked for prescription benefit managers. So had that background. I got my MBA in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Then I moved to London with a startup company. They're one of these .coms, but there it was called a .co.uk, which promptly went practically bust. And we had to kind of reimagine ourselves. And so we started being a consultancy for the NHS in England, really looking at how to utilize pharmacies in a better way and pharmacists, the talents of pharmacists. So my background's purely business, so I'm not a clinician or a pharmacist or anything like that. But then I moved to Norway in 2005 and continued working in the healthcare field. And, I'd been reading about neglected tropical diseases for quite a while, and I was quite interested in it. So I decided that I would do a PhD looking at innovation business models for neglected tropical diseases. And so I applied for some money and got my grant was approved. And so I started being a researcher on this very niche area. So I got to know Peter Beyer, uh,
Okay.
and so I worked a little bit. I worked for the Norwegian Development Agency, looking at a UN Commission on Life-Saving Commodities. I've worked with Peter at the WHO in different initiatives, looking at access to essential medicines, a little bit of that. And then Jon Arne Røtningen was my supervisor. And he said, what about antibiotics? And I didn't know so much about antibiotics, but I started learning and saw that there was a market failure, just like a lot of the neglected tropical diseases, and started to read more. And in 2013, really started working full time on antibiotics.
You may have told me all that once before, but somehow it went in one ear and out the other. And I'm not going to add you to the list, this growing list of people I knew that Kevin got into this because he got fascinated by the IP issues. And then I talked to Peter recently, and he said, I'm an IP lawyer, and I got interested in this because of the IP and the access issues. And here you are, and you actually intersected with Peter in talking about this. It's just very interesting. I did not realize the depth of your business background. I mean, it was evident from the things you knew to talk about, but I didn't realize actually that that's how you'd gotten trained in this. So, so that sort of takes us to 2013. You've got your PhD. You've been studying this area, and then 2014, and we start Drive AB. And as I recall, you were the academic, or you're part of the academic leadership for Drive AB. So, refresh us a little bit about the beginnings of Drive AB from your perspective, and kind of what has been the impact of Drive AB?
Well, I think when we all met in Geneva back in 2014, I think we really didn't, we had no idea. We kind of started off thinking, oh, this will be your typical kind of research project. We'll do write some articles, we'll get to know some nice people, and that will all be good. But really, Drive AB was unlike any other research project that I've been on, because we met so often with each other, and we were so it was a partnership like no other. I mean, I think we talked weekly with Kevin, and I mean, it was a really intense looking at all kinds of aspects. We talked to unusual people that I would never have talked to. We talked to, people at the International Space Station to try to figure out how to do financing of big projects. We talked to defense industries. We were looking at access issues. It was really kind of, so creative and without bounds, but yet really focused on a very specific aspect. So I think it's one of the most enjoyable projects I've worked on. I got to know many friends, colleagues that became
Yeah.
friends in the process, and so that was very, very good. But I think the impact is there was so much going on at the time. So Drive AB started up, and then the AMR review with Lord O'Neill started up at about the same time. Um, we had also Duke Margolis in the US started up just shortly after looking at it. We had Germany as a part of the G7. They hired the Boston Consulting Group to write a report. So there was just a lot of activity. And because Drive AB was the one that started first and ended last, we really heavily intersected with all of those initiatives.
Yeah.
So it was very fulfilling.
Yeah, for me, the part of it the impact and the reports are great. The thing that I still sort of, I guess, smile about is Kevin Otterson likes to call this the 2 degrees of Drive AB as opposed to the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. There's this the group of about 100 of us. We got to know each other, and we talked, and we fought, and we argued, and we taught each other, and it was all these different perspectives: the public health perspective, the academic perspective, the civil society perspective. It was that was when we were thinking about making Drive AB happen. I had this hope that somehow that group would turn into this fabulous debating society. And I think that even now, the alumni of Drive AB, it's kind of hard to be in the room without one of them or us, so to speak, right?
That's true. That's very true.
Yeah.
And I think also, but I think, at Drive AB, we were looking at not only innovation, but we were looking at access and we were looking at
Yeah.
stewardship. And,
Yes.
and really nobody else was looking at all the three of
Right.
those in a really bundled perspective. And as Drive AB, before we were even finished, we had so many successes that, Drive AB partially contributed to. We had CARB-X, what an astounding success that is. Set up BARDA and Wellcome Trust and others. Great. Where the clinical pipeline is in much better shape today because of that. We had GARD-P being initiated with the partnership between WHO and DNDi. There was really just so much push activity that was coming about. So it was really rewarding to see not only were we researching, but things were actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is interesting to see the ripples in the pond that have come from that very, very interesting project. And in Drive AB, the principal area where you worked was on the package about the incentive structures, right? Why don't you remind everybody about there were four, you filtered through a whole bunch of possible ways to encourage antibiotics to come forward. Like, as I recall, there's that appendix that's got 35 different mechanisms that you looked at, right? And you wound up thinking that 4 would matter.
Yes. Yep. So we focused on. Now you've got me, John, because I wasn't completely up to date on that. But we talked about push funding.
Push incentives, push funding,
Push
right?
incentive was definitely there, so we had to do that. And then, of course, we have pull incentives. I'll come back to that. We thought that there was a need for a pipeline coordinator. So pipeline coordinator is basically an organization that manages a portfolio of assets, priority assets towards different targets. So that could be someone like, it could be an organization like Carbex or GuardP, looking at a portfolio. Obviously, GuardP is more an active developer role with their companies. Carbex is more of a financing. And then we also recommended a long-term sustainability model because, as you talked with Peter, we have major problems with access, not only to new antibiotics, but also to old. And that's a major issue. So once we have a pull incentive in place, once that pull incentive ends, we don't want to lose access to that important antibiotic. But the main recommendation of Drive AB was the pull incentive, the market entry rewards. So really looking at, we're not using these antibiotics. We don't want to use them. As you say, they're the fire extinguisher. They're there if we need them. Hopefully we never have to use them. They're there as a last resort. And really, we can't depend upon unit sales to ensure that these will stay on the market. So the pull incentive, we said there's lots of different terminology for a pull incentive, but it's basically a delinked incentive that ensures that you get a predictable payment every year for having that new antibiotic available.
Having it available, whether you actually treat an infection or put out a fire. Yeah. So Drive AB was 2014 to 2017. And you have then moved on to another project that just recently read out its final report, the EU JAMRAI project. Tell us about the EU JAMRAI.
Yeah, so for non-Europeans, joint action, so the JAMRAI stands for the EU Joint Action on AMR and healthcare-associated infections. So a joint action is basically a tool that the EU uses to try to get countries to work together. So there's lots of joint actions on various topics like health technology assessment. And then, so AMR, JAMRAI was the first one on AMR, and it was hugely popular. So we had 40 countries working on this, I think, or 40 organizations. So 40 organizations working on this and 24 countries, sorry, so I got that.
More than Europe?
No, sorry, just Europe.
Okay.
Sorry. My mistake. I think it's 24 countries and 40 organizations within Europe.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's different work packages looking at different areas, looking at infection prevention and control and looking at stewardship. And so I co-led the work package looking at research and innovation with INSERM, Marie-Cécile Ploy from INSERM. So we were looking at this. And a joint action isn't about research. It's about looking at how can we collaborate better across Europe in order to look at important areas that need implementation. And so this seemed like a natural place to bring in the discussion about pull incentives. Because while in Drive AB, we could talk to a lot of academics and a lot of industry, and we could talk to some countries. There was the US and the UK and Sweden really leading the charge on AMR, but a lot of the other countries seemed more reticent to talk about what were their feelings on pull incentives, what was their interest, their feedback. And it seemed like this was a great opportunity to take and seek their feedback under the remit of JAMRAI. So one of the things that we decided to do was to go out there and talk to countries in a very informal Chatham House rule approach to hear what they thought.
Yeah, and you've released that policy brief, and walk us through the content of that, because I think that was it's fascinating. I love the way you start with the stories about Melinta and a fire in a factory.
Right. Well, I mean, when we went we talked with 10 European countries, in-depth interviews, and then we worked as well with the Global AMR R&D Hub. They were also interested, and so they hooked us up with Canada, Japan, and South Africa to have the same conversations. And what we heard is that, countries are very worried about access to both new and old antibiotics. Melinta has a brand new antibiotic approved by the European Medicines Agency in 2018, but it's only available in a handful of European countries right now. It's considered innovative. It's against one of the critical priority pathogens identified by the WHO. It's absolutely the kind of antibiotic you want to have available in your country. But the case is, it's not leading necessarily from EMA marketing authorization, is not leading to having them available in country, which is a concern. And that's about profitability. So I will probably talk about that. But then the same thing is happening with older antibiotics and not profitability as well, because the margins have been squeezed so low on a lot of these older antibiotics and especially the narrow spectrum antibiotics that don't have very large markets, they're tough to get a hold of now. So maybe you're dependent upon one or two active pharmaceutical ingredient supplier, and something goes wrong there, like there was a fire in a factory, in an API factory in 2017 for piperacillin tazobactam, and that was it. Then
Right.
a global shortage.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about a drug as important as Pip/Tazo, very reliable drug we've been using for decades. And it's got a supply chain that at least at some points is one factory, one building, one team of people wide. And if something goes wrong there, comes to a complete halt, and it can be months before you get a fix on that. I mean, it really is. Particularly the sterile injectables are delicate things to manufacture.
Mm-hmm.
A lyophilizer can blow up and you lose 100,000 vials, as I learned when I used to oversee one of those supply chains. It really is delicate. So if I look at the report, I sort of see two threads coming out of it. One of them has to do with supply chain security. I see a conversation about that. And I also see a conversation about, I'm going to call it the quality of the data around a new drug. And this will take us into sort of superiority, non-inferiority land, and how you develop data on a drug in resistant infections. So let's actually take the two things and talk about where you see those things going.
Well, I think that the positive, one of the really positive results that we heard was that, it's only been 2017, right, 2020, 2021. So 3-4 years after Drive AB. And countries understand that they need to pay for antibiotics differently. They know that. So 11 out of the 13 countries that we talked to understood that they needed to do that.
That's a big
Um,
step.
yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really successful. But the problem is it gets a little fuzzy in the details. So market entry rewards are a little bit complicated. And so, we have different implementation with the UK is doing a fully delinked incentive, and that is great. They're leading the way on that. But it from the outside, maybe it's a little worrying because it seems kind of complicated. It takes a while. You have to have, some processes in place. And so there's a little bit of concern. We started our interviews before COVID-19. I'm sure with the COVID-19 didn't help the matter,
Yeah.
but countries would really like to have, a little box and says, here you go, this is how you should do a pull incentive, and this will ensure that you have access to the antibiotics that you
Yes.
need in your country.
Interesting. Yeah.
But the problem is, of course, that national countries, they have it's sovereignty over pricing and reimbursement and procurement. So these are areas that are untouchable almost.
Yeah. And the UK's pilot project has benefited by the fact that the UK had this established machine for thinking about value. They had NICE and the University of York who could crank out, deep thought papers. Not everybody has that, has built that machinery. And this notion, I hadn't thought about what you just said. Here I am, I'm the Minister of Finance of country X, just give me some clean directions. Make it simple. If it requires advanced science, I'm not going to get it done. That's an interesting theme that you need to make it simple, sort of a thing. So you mentioned need to pay for it differently. Let's talk first about what's the implication of that for this work on supply chain security? I think that's a very direct one. And Peter Beyer said that there's some work coming on that. And so talk a little bit about what people are doing to get us educated in and then take action on supply chain security.
Well, so supply chain security, I think it's the same for new as old, except for the new antibiotics, the supply chain tends to be, you don't really have shortages of those products. They may not be available, but the idea is that if countries really are interested in ensuring that they have access to the right antibiotic at the right time, and they don't care if it's old or new.
Right.
So why don't we use a simple mechanism like Sweden? So Sweden's got an annual revenue guarantee. They selected 5 antibiotics that were newly marketed in Sweden, which is interesting enough because one of those is fosfomycin, an old antibiotic, right? But newly marketed in Sweden. And so they took these 5 antibiotics and said, we'll give you an annual revenue guarantee. We have very low resistance in Sweden. We don't use a lot of antibiotics, but we want to ensure that we have access. And we will give you a revenue guarantee every year. If you don't sell that much, the government will top it off to make sure that each company has predictable value. And it's not a high value. It's only about 400,000 euros.
A year.
So it's not per year, and so it's not taking up the R&D cost, but it is. But this is it's a threshold that could be moved right up and down. Right. So and the fact is, Sweden, they got up and they got it running very quickly, and so this could be a way to say, okay, if I want to have access to phenoxymethyl penicillin, it doesn't, maybe we don't have to pay very much, but we have to give, maybe predictability would help these older manufacturers and really keep them in producing these older antibiotics. And maybe and when it comes to something like Melinta's Vabomere, you're going to it's going to be a much higher bar, but that's going to ensure access. And so countries are really looking for a common solution that will ensure, and they want it to be negotiable. So it's really touching pricing and procurement and reimbursement decisions. It's really hands off. That's their area, and they don't want anyone else to do that. So we came up basically with an idea that you could set up a coordinator role who could take care of the paperwork. They could have a common contract template, work with the regulators to determine which of these new antibiotics should be coming through. The countries could say which of the older antibiotics they're interested in. And this coordinator role could then kind of facilitate the process. Companies decide if they want to participate or not, as well as governments decide if they want to participate or not. There's a process. And in the end, you have an annual revenue guarantee, negotiated amount per antibiotic per government. But the coordinator handles all the management, all the admin of it. And in the end, you get contracts between companies and governments. And so that's our proposal. So we'll see, as the EU pharmaceutical strategy has committed to trying a pull incentive in 2021. Right. So we're excited to see what they're going to do there. And I'm working with them to try to give this evidence so to inform their decision-making processes.
Yeah, well, I mean, good. I think that we do have to deal with the sort of the fundamental cost of making the product. And my simple rule of thumb is that a sterile injectable costs you about $25 million a year to run the plant that makes it. And you got to pay the people, you got to take care of the plants, you got to do the paperwork, blah 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 blah. And that's for making a reasonable amount of drug, sort of that's in that range. And if somebody's not getting at least that much revenue, there's actually you can't keep the lights on for very long at the plant. It's an interesting problem. So the other part of this is this thing about deciding what's worth paying for, and this is where the UK has, as you said, it's more complex because they've broken it down into this granular point system and so forth. Whereas Sweden just said new drug, simple and very clean, clear, simple language. And I was struck by the quote. So now I've got a copy of your policy brief here. It talks about that the 11 countries expressed support, but the question of what's the value, and here's the quote: antibiotics are being approved for indications where there is no intention that they will be used. This sends the wrong signal. Would prefer that antibiotics are tested against drug resistance instead. If the trials need to be done in high resistance countries and they are performed according to existing standards, this is preferable. And you and I have talked a lot over time about the challenges with doing these trials. And we watched, you talked about plazomicin earlier, Achaogen's plazomicin, and they worked really hard to do a study in only resistant bacteria. As my understanding is they screened about 2,000 people and wound up enrolling about 60. There's clearly a tension there. Yeah. Talk to me, but you've been listening. The strengths of this project was you went out and listened to these other countries. What is it that they want to know? Sort of expand that box a little bit and talk to us about what we need to be doing to up the level of this conversation.
Well, I think, you put out this really excellent session now on non-inferiority versus superiority on your YouTube channel. And so everything I think that you said in that is they're in agreement with. And it's the last bit. So the last bit about having, you talked about having, it's really tough to have your main trial to be a superiority trial. Okay, and they understand that. Countries understand that. Okay. But what they really want to see is they want to see those last trials. And like you say, they may not be randomized. What you're doing is you're finding the patients that have that need, and they want to see the information out of these small trials. Okay. And really pushing for some of these clinical trial networks. Wellcome Trust is talking about a Southeast Asian antibiotic clinical trial network, and really trying to enable. So of course, because we can't do this in Europe and the US because the trial costs will be phenomenal. So we need to go and try to find out places where there is higher resistance levels in order to at least gather some data so that when that drug comes to market, the physician knows, okay, I can use it here. I've got this data at least.
Helpful to hear it stated that way. I mean, it's just a message that I really struggle to put into short sentences. The discussion in that YouTube thing is like 15 minutes long. I mean, it's kind of what it takes to explain it. So so let me point at one element of it. This first sentence: antibiotics are approved for indications where there is no intention they will be used. And this is a community level tension. In the regulatory world, the label covers the things that you studied in a formal way. And so you study complicated UTI, you get complicated UTI mentioned, and that's the easiest one to study. Europe, EMA has the ability sometimes to put in another indication that says sort of a more general catch-all, gram-negative infections in general. Yeah. With the FDA, they're not able to do that. There's a requirement for a certain quality of data in terms of the character of the control information. So the net effect is that this first study you do, complicated UTI, you're right. I'm studying a complicated UTI because I can study it. in non-geologic time, but nosocomial pneumonia is where I'd actually kind of like to use it at the end of the day. And that trial is only another $50 to $70 million to do the nosocomial pneumonia trial. So is there any, did you bump into any discussions along the way of whether there is an approach, sort of a harmonization to this issue of the data you'd like to have versus the data that you can have? And it feeds into regulatory rules, but regulatory rules are really a community level decision about what's required. And it's not, they're not like the law of gravity. But we don't change them lightly. So did any conversation come up about addressing that problem, the issue? Yes, first indication is complicated UTI, but I, as a doc, I'll go use it for other things if you give me a little bit of data.
We didn't go so deep because, of course, we only have one regulator in these countries. So when we were having the interviews, I was talking with people from the national governments. But we have, of course, national regulators in country as well. But really, I think that there's not a great understanding about this because, as you say, it is terribly complicated. Taking you 15 minutes to explain it in a very nice manner. But what they're coming up with is that they really do want to not necessarily change the regulatory processes, but do these small type of trials. And I believe that some drugs have gone through these. So you see, I think Ceftaricol did against best available practice. Right. And I think that's really kind of the lead that they're looking for, is that, okay, if you need a non-inferiority in trial for the main trial, that's okay. But really, can we expand a little bit and look beyond that and see if there is some data to be provided here that adds extra benefit, especially when you're doing your antibiotic guidelines development, to make sure that you know where they should be placed, what type of patients should be receiving these.
Yeah, I think most of the advanced agents, more recent agents, have done a versus best available therapy kind of a trial, and those tend to be unevenly randomized. You put most of the people on the test article, and they tend to be relatively small, and so it's statistically they're never compelling, to be honest with you, and since people are going to work like crazy to put the people on the best available therapy arm on something that they hope works. The idea of generating superiority data, sometimes it'll happen, but the goal is to actually be sure that everybody gets something, participants in that study get something. But there may be toxicity advantages. I mean, there are reasons why the new agent might be easier to use, and so all that stuff can come through. So what you're saying is that there's the beginning of an understanding that the core data that gets the approval, the randomized trial that you can readily do in a definable group, complicated UTI, is great. But there's a willingness to use this messier other data to support the idea of reimbursement. This is kind of the theme I'm hearing from you. Right?
That was the message that I heard from several countries, that they were really, really looking for. If it had to be a small, messier trial, they were still interested in getting that. Yeah. And if there was some way that they could make it into a slightly larger trial by having more global perspective to that trial, they were really interested in that. So yeah. I think this is maybe something that needs further development and maybe more conversation, really talking with policymakers in countries to understand what they're looking for. I think this could be an area where we could find some easy compromises here.
Yeah, and then the last step will be to get that into the product labeling, and that's where the messiness interferes as well. I just flagged that up. So when you run a project on that, be sure and think about that question and include the idea of what it takes to get it into product labeling in at least an indirect way. I mean, that's.
But guidelines, they don't necessarily always rely on the label. So
that's right.
So they look at the available evidence too.
Yeah, society guidelines can go beyond the label, and that's something that IDS, the Infectious Disease Society of America, has recently started to do, is try to put together a everything you need to know about this advanced agent, including the stuff that you kind of have to guess about guideline. And we know that sometimes you have to go off the map. And here's what I would do, sort of a guideline. And I'm looking forward to those. Well, I mean, that's cool. So does EU Jamra have a next phase? Is there?
There is some discussion about having a phase 2, but right now with Corona, who knows? Yeah, really what's going to happen.
Let's now turn to some other stuff from EU Jamra. You're wearing something that I know was an invention of EU Jamra. Tell me about that thing that you've got on.
Yes, we developed this symbol. We have this amazing Spanish communication team, and they are so creative, and they decided that they were going to develop a symbol for antibiotic resistance, something that could easily be made at home. So this is basically 2 hearts put together to look like 2 antibiotic capsules. And they had a competition. A Swedish man won the competition. I think there was a couple hundred contestants. And so now we have this antibiotic resistance symbol that could be used. I mean, of course, you know, we've had the fire extinguisher as well, but now we also have this symbol that can be proudly worn.
Does yours come apart?
It probably does, but I probably won't take it apart because I'm not sure I'll get it. It took me twice to make it, but otherwise it's quite easy to make. So I'm not the best with scissors and paper. So
well, it's cute, and I think I look forward to seeing it as things we get everybody to wear their antibody. I need to get one and start wearing one around the Jamrai symbol. Fun. So
well, it's not just Jamrai, it's everybody's. There's no copyright, there's nothing. It's free to use. Anybody can use it, so it's yours. So use it however you will to reflect on antibiotic resistance.
The universal symbol for AMR. We've got the 2 hearts that turn into a red and a white capsule, and fabulous. Love it. So there were some other interesting things that Jamrai did, and I just because it's fun. There's a computer game or an app. Can you tell me a little bit about that and what it's meant to do?
Yeah, so this our amazing communications team as well. They reached out and developed an app to teach children more about antibiotic resistance and to teach them about bacteria. And it's a card game that's obviously put into an app form. So you can download it for free and play this game. I think it works as well for children over 6 years of age. Could probably do quite a good job about it. And really just have some fun and learn something about antibiotic resistance in the process.
I'll have to give it a go. I'm over 6, and so probably I qualify to play the game. That's you have some quite clever people doing your communication work.
They're fantastic.
But I think I've come to believe over time that the biggest part of what we as a community are contributing is a simple ways to understand this area. If you mentioned the fire extinguisher, that's an example of something that's quick and easy, and your heart is, I think that just feeds nicely into the theme of saving lives and protecting each other. And I think that's all very clever. What else are the highlights of this project? What else would you like people to notice when they go to the website and dig around a little bit?
Well, so now I'm writing a lot of papers. So trying to, even though the joint action is actually finished, Jamrai's finished, but still now we have to publish. So so the final results will be coming out I'm working on 2 or 3 publications now. So we'll be doing that, but really just I think this is going to be an exciting year because we're going to see, the UK is moving speedily along now with the pull incentive. Sweden's moving along. I'm really excited to see what the EU does now with their pull incentive. Germany implemented an orphan drug-like pricing for antibiotics. So there's a lot of market side activity happening. So I think it'll be interesting to follow along and see what happens in the EU and see, maybe Pasteur Act will be approved in the
And
US and really game-changing activities over the globe.
yeah, and it's cool that they're diverse, I think.
Mhm.
Different kinds of strategies, and in a few years from now, hopefully we'll all have some better ideas about what works, what doesn't work, or what's best suited to different situations. I mean, it's a very interesting strategy. Um, what else do we need to talk about? What else do you want to highlight from your world?
Well, I can just mention that another project that I just started working on is going back to the older antibiotics. Is here in Norway, we're looking at what do we need to do to ensure that we have continued access to narrow spectrum penicillins and
Yeah.
important older antibiotics. We use 30% of our antibiotics in total are narrow spectrum penicillins. So we're still using Fleming's penicillin here in Norway, and it's really important. And so we're looking at different opportunities if we need to do local production. Is that something that we need to do, or are there opportunities to work in different types of models? And so this also will be coming out this year. Um, so it'll be interesting to see what kind of solutions could be put in place. And I'm slightly partial. I would like to see a pull incentive put in place for both old and new, because I think, if we get that pull incentive in place, and it'll bring more countries in. Maybe they start by trying to ensure that they get access to the older antibiotics that they're concerned about, but they're also going to want these new antibiotics as well. And I think that this could be a great way to really gain some momentum. So we'll see what happens.
So a Norwegian supply chain project focused on the older narrow spectrum drugs, starting with penicillin G, I guess.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and that's a great one to work on because it gets you into the issues of sterile injectables. It also, one of the quirks of the penicillins, all the penicillins, all the beta lactams, is that each one of them requires its own building,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Because of the concern that even trace contamination from once, if you're making the penicillin here and the antihypertensive in the next room, if you get any of the penicillin into the antihypertensive, there's a risk that somebody who takes that will be penicillin allergic and have a big issue. So the idea that every one of them has to have its own building, you can't use it for anything else, which also part of the reason why it costs what it costs to make the darn things. Yeah,
That's
fascinating.
right.
Well, I mean, I look forward to that. That's super. Um, well, thank you. This has been a lot of fun to catch up with you, and and to be refreshed on how you became a policy wonk. That's cool.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always to talk with you, John.
Quite a story. So stay safe, and thanks again.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Wow, what fun to get to visit with Christine today. Just, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And as a reminder, there are some links below the video to materials that we've talked about in the video. So take a look at those. And if you enjoyed the video overall, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.